Imagine the tolling of distant church bells reverberating through narrow cobblestone streets, each peal echoing a warning of the unseen horrors about to unfold. The soft, deliberate rustle of ancient parchment under candlelight speaks of secrets penned by trembling hands. Picture, if you will, a child standing alone in the flickering glow of a dying hearth, his eyes wide with sorrow as he grapples with a grief too vast for his 14 years, a grief that would, unbeknownst to him, ignite the spark of a gift, transcending the bounds of time. In this crucible of loss and fear, where pestilence sweeps through Provence like a silent specter and the drums of war loom beyond the horizon, a singular truth emerges. Profound tragedy often heralds unparalleled insight. Consider the psychological alchemy at play as young Michel de Nostredame, orphaned by plague and cast adrift in a world teetering on the edge of collapse, channels his anguish into an unearthly focus, melding the precision of a budding physician with the esoteric language of the stars. This convergence of science and mysticism, seldom acknowledged in its time, forms the bedrock of his later prophecies, hinting at a methodological rigor beneath his cryptic verse. Yet there is a darker undercurrent threading through his earliest revelations, the uncanny ability to distill chaos into evocative quatrains, each a prism refracting both dread and possibility. As we lean in, voices hushed and hearts racing, we grasp the paradox of Nostradamus's origin, the childhood crucible that forged not just a healer, but a seer whose words would come to haunt the annals of history. It is here, in the shadowy interplay of memory and foresight, that the legend is born. A boy whose personal cataclysm unlocked visions of world-altering events, whose pen scratched warnings of calamity even as he tended the fevered sick. And so, with the final toll fading into silence, we stand at the threshold of the untold story, breath caught on the precipice, drawn forward by the promise of revelations yet to convulse the minds of kings and commoners alike. This is the untold origin of the man we know as Nostradamus. In the scorching summer of 1503, beneath the merciless Provençal sun that baked the narrow, winding streets of Saint-Rémy, a young Michel de Nostredame first learned the fragile balance between life and oblivion, a lesson etched into his soul by both merciless fate and the dusty, ancient wisdom whispered through his mother's herbal tinctures. Imagine the heat shimmering over sunflower fields as Michel, barely 6 years old, raced down cobblestone lanes to greet his mother, a woman whose gentle hands coaxed healing from chamomile and willow bark. And his father, descended from a proud, noble line, whose quiet dignity masked a mind steeped in Latin manuscripts and classical lore. The Provençal air carried the faint scent of lavender and the promise of harvest. Yet beneath that lilting perfume lurked the specter of decay. Unseen spores riding the breeze, ready to torment the unwary. And then, between the waning moons of 1512 and 1513, the plague arrived, first as distant murmur, then as an infernal drumbeat of coughing and fever, echoing through humble cottages and grand manors alike. It swept through Michel's family like a vengeful tide, claiming his beloved brother Jacques, whose laughter had once followed him like a shadow through the olive groves, and then his mother, whose deathly pallor transformed her once kind eyes into crevices of sorrow. In that crucible of grief, where the boundary between scientific knowledge and mystic dread blurred, Michel's resolve crystallized. He would not bow to the same merciless whimsy that stole his kin. Deep in the silent aftermath, as the village reeled and carved hastily dug graves into the earthen floor, the boy's grief mutated into a fierce determination. This vow, both a fragile human pledge and the nascent spark of his future alchemy, reveals the paradox of human resilience. Only through the darkest suffering can one glimpse the faint, flickering light of purpose. And so, the same hands that Once gently ground herbs now trembled over fever charts and star maps as Michel sought patterns in the heavens to explain the chaos on Earth. Here, the roots of one of history's most enigmatic figures coiled tightly around this moment of personal catastrophe. A noble youth, thrust into the role of healer by necessity, who would in time transcend mere medicine to become a conduit for cosmic insight. We see in this formative loss both the raw material of prophecy and the analytical mind of a nascent scientist. It is the alchemical fusion of grief and intellect that would later lend such uncanny authority to his quatrains. And as Michel swore beneath those sun-bleached walls to wage war against the unseen enemy, he unknowingly set in motion the currents of destiny that would carry him far beyond Provence's pastoral serenity, into courts of queens and the whispered anxieties of empires. Yet for now he remained a boy shaped by tragedy and tutored by the ancients, his heart heavy with the weight of mortality, his gaze already drifting skyward in search of meaning hurtling across the firmament. In that crucible of sun, soil, and sorrow, the legend of Nostradamus was not yet written in verse, but in the tremors of a young soul determined to master the forces, both terrestrial and celestial, that conspire to unmake us all. In the pre-dawn hush of Aix-en-Provence, where narrow stone alleys still bore the chill of night and the scent of rosemary lingered in the air, a 14-year-old Michel de Nostredame arrived clutching little more than a leather satchel and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. And as he crossed the threshold of the university's venerable medical faculty, the hush of centuries seemed to stir, sensing that this boy, barely in his teens, would reshape the boundaries of science and the arcane. Imagine him bowing to the austere professors in their black robes, reciting a passage of Hippocrates in flawless Latin before pivoting seamlessly into a discussion of Euclid's geometries in Greek, an exhibition of erudition so profound that the oldest scholars, who had weathered decades of rigorous disputations, exchanged astonished glances, as if witnessing a gifted prodigy born not of common lineage, but of some celestial design. Yet Michel's intellect was only half of the story. By day, he stalked the plague-racked quarters with solemn purpose, applying poultices of marigold and elderflower, soothing the fevered brow with moistened cloths scented by his mother's long-cherished herbal recipes, all the while observing the ravages of pestilence with clinical detachment. By night, he would slip away to a hidden alcove in the university's ancient library, a place where moonlight filtered through stained glass and illuminated the intricate carvings of Ptolemy's star maps, where, with trembling fingers, he pored over Arabic treatises on celestial motions, charting the silver arc of Saturn against the pale blue swirl of Jupiter, convinced that the patterns writ in the heavens held the keys to the human soul's fate. This dual passion, of healer and astrologer, surgeon and soothsayer, bristled with tension, for in the Renaissance's dawning rationality, such unholy alliances were whispered to court both ridicule and suspicion. And then, as if summoned by some dark providence, a mysterious patient arrived, a cloaked aristocrat brought in on a litter of silk cushions, his breath ragged with fever, and his mind aflame with visions of distant battlefields and cataclysmic storms. In delirious half-dreams, the nobleman spoke of emperors toppled by unseen forces, of plagues that rose from the earth like malevolent spirits, and of a man of iron marching armies beneath crimson skies, visions so vivid they scorched Michel's memory, searing an unspoken question into his heart. Could the same arts he employed to combat the ravages of the body also unlock the riddles of the future? As he tended the patient's hot brow and applied poultices crushed from sage and yarrow, Michel observed not only the weakening pulse, but the flicker of prophetic authority behind those fevered eyes, and in that moment, the alchemy of healing and foresight coalesced into a singular epiphany. Analysis of the skies and analysis of the sick were no longer discrete practices. They were entwined strands of a single tapestry, each informing the other in ways that defied orthodox pedagogy. Here, in the hushed lamplight of a makeshift infirmary, Michel de Nostredame tasted the intoxicating promise that to heal might require glimpsing what lay ahead, and to predict might demand the same compassion and rigor that cured the sick. Thus began the true metamorphosis of the scholar's path, a journey that would lead him beyond the vaulted halls of Aix, beyond mere remedies and charts, into the realm of cryptic quatrains that would echo across centuries, beckoning us still, to ponder whether the measure of a man's genius is found not in the questions he asks of the past, but in the fearless pursuit of the mysteries yet unrevealed. Banished from the hallowed halls of Aix-en-Provence amid hushed accusations of dabbling in forbidden arts, Michel de Nostredame found himself cast into a world both familiar and alien, where the echoes of academic disapproval mingled with the distant toll of village church bells heralding new outbreaks of plague. Stripped of institutional support, yet unbowed in spirit, he roamed the sun-bleached roads of Provence and the mist-shrouded valleys of Languedoc, a solitary figure traversing a land aflame with superstition and fear. By day, he set up makeshift infirmaries in abandoned manor houses, applying poultices of rue and sage to grey-faced peasants whose ragged breaths rose and fell like the final gasps of dying embers. Each wrist he pressed, each fever chart he noted, carried the weight of his mother's herbal lore and the fresh ache of loss that had first propelled him into medicine. As dusk bled into night, he traded his healing robes for the solitude of a candlelit tavern in Salon de Provence, where he would unroll brittle star charts across a rough-hewn wooden table, the flickering flame casting long, trembling shadows on his furrowed brow. There, amid the clink of ale mugs and the low murmur of locals spinning tales of omens and portents, Michel sketched planetary alignments with a scholar's precision, tracing the slow, deliberate dance of Jupiter's moons and Saturn's pale ring, his quill scratching like a distant thunderclap against the parchment. In those moments, the boundary between his roles as healer and astrologer dissolved. The same hands that soothed the feverish brow now mapped the arching pathways of the heavens, convinced that each stellar conjunction carried a hidden prescription for humanity's ills. Yet in the stillness of pre-dawn, when the tavern emptied, and only the wind sighed through cracked shutters, he was haunted by the ghosts of his past, the hollow-eyed visage of his brother Jacques, lost to the plague's merciless tide, and the gentle countenance of his mother, whose lullabies of lavender and chamomile now seemed like distant echoes in a cavern of grief. This inner turmoil, part scientific skepticism, part mystical yearning, gnawed at him as fiercely as any malady he had treated. For every rational triumph against the disease reminded him that unseen forces, whether microbial or celestial, governed the fragile human condition. Analysis of his own turmoil suggests that it was here, in the crucible of exile, that the alchemical synthesis of his dual passions matured into something altogether new, a methodology that wove empirical observation and esoteric insight into a single tapestry of prophetic foresight. He began to record his visions in hastily bound journals, cryptic verses that married the cold arithmetic of medical notation with the poetic cadence of unfolding destiny. And each nightside revelation seemed to mirror the traumas he carried. The scorched fields of plague-swept villages, the ashen skies of his childhood nightmares, the relentless turning of the celestial spheres. And so, as he moved from hamlet to hamlet, Michel de Nostredame was no longer merely a wandering healer or an amateur stargazer. He became a living conduit between the suffering of the living and the whispering expanse of the cosmos. In that liminal space between dusk and dawn, between the tangible and the transcendent, his inner conflict, once a painful fracture, was forged into the very foundation of his later quatrains. whose haunting precision would captivate monarchs and commoners alike. The trials of exile thus did more than drive him from academic comfort. They stripped away artifice, revealing the core of a man who would one day claim that the equations of sickness and the equations of stars were but two dialects of the same universal language. And in the silent communion of candle flame and starlight, Michel's metamorphosis was complete. The roving healer astronomer emerged not merely transformed, but transfigured, bearing within him the alchemical promise that true wisdom often rises from the ashes of personal catastrophe. Under the cold luminescence of a lone comet streaking across the ink-black midnight sky, Michel de Nostredame lay restless in his simple cot, the world around him hushed, save for the low rumble of distant thunder and the faint indistinct murmur of voices he could not quite discern. In that charged stillness, where the boundary between earth and ether seemed to thin, his mind surrendered to a vision so vivid it scorched itself into his memory, cities aflame, their stone battlements crumbling beneath an unholy conflagration, crown-clad rulers toppled as though by invisible hands. And most unsettling of all, a towering man of iron, whose relentless march cast long, twisted shadows over a ravaged populace. This was no ordinary fever dream born of exhaustion or illness, but a tableau etched by some deeper, uncanny intelligence, its every detail underscored by the echo of whispered warnings that curled around Michel's senses like serpents in the dark. As he sank deeper into this nocturnal revelation, his rational mind, trained in the rigors of medicine and the exactitude of celestial charting, scrambled to impose order on what defied explanation, cataloguing each image with the clinical detachment of a physician noting a patient's symptoms even as his heart thundered with primal awe. Yet analysis of the dreamscape's symbolism revealed a tapestry of portentous meaning. The burning cities hinted at man's self-destructive hubris. The fallen kings spoke of fragile power doomed to decay, and the ironclad figure embodied the relentless march of forces beyond human control. In that singular moment, the empirical and the mystical converged, forging in Michel's psyche an inextricable bond between foresight and fate. Beneath his closed eyelids, the scene shifted seamlessly. Ash-choked skies parted to reveal a pale sun, haloed by a ring of fire, illuminating a world simultaneously alien and eerily familiar. The crack of thunder intensified, not as mere meteorological phenomenon, but as punctuation in the grand narrative unfolding before him. A narrative in which he, the observer, was both scribe and seer. He perceived then the gravity of what had transpired. This dream was no mere byproduct of fevered imagination, but the genesis of a gift that would reshape his life's trajectory and echo through the corridors of history. As the final flash of the vision faded, leaving him trembling in darkness, Michel felt an irrevocable shift within. The young scholar, once confined to the cloistered halls of medicine and astrology, was reborn as a conduit of prophecy, bound by the promise of this first revelation. It was here, in that midnight crucible beneath the comet's arc, that he understood the true alchemy of his calling, that the same analytical rigor he applied to charting the stars could decipher the cryptic language of destiny itself. And so he made an unspoken vow to the silent night, to record with unwavering precision and poetic resonance every fragment of the vision that had chosen him, transforming his private revelation into a public testament. That night changed everything, he would later write, though in his penning he would veil the raw immediacy of the dream in layered quatrains, inviting readers to unravel their hidden meanings across the ages. But for Michel himself, the memory of thunder whispers and the comet's pale glow remained unvarnished, an immutable anchor to the moment when fate's whisper became an inner voice, guiding him toward a destiny as haunting as it was extraordinary. the very crucible from which the legend of Nostradamus would forever emerge. Michel awoke with a violent start, the night's visions still clinging to his mind like spectral tendrils as he clutched the edge of his tattered notebook, its pages yellowed and creased from feverish midnight scribblings of star charts and cryptic quatrains. The quill's ink blotched across the margins, evidence of the trembling hand that had raced to capture every fractured image of that first prophetic dream, images too potent to risk fading into the haze of dawn. In the ghostly half-light of his chamber, the analytical part of his mind surged to the fore. Each symbol he had recorded, from the crooked sigil of the Man of Iron to the silent ring of the comet's trajectory, demanded methodical interpretation, as if his own survival depended on teasing out a precise meaning hidden beneath layers of metaphor. Yet, even as he annotated celestial conjunctions with the steely deliberation of a seasoned astronomer, he could not shake the lingering echo of that primal rush, the visceral terror and awe that had gripped him when thunder rolled like a cosmic drum and whispering voices spoke of kingdoms undone. This duality, scientific rigor wedded to ineffable mystery, had become the very crucible of his transformation, forging a new identity that straddled the rational and the arcane. He paused, breath caught in his chest as if listening for the faintest echo of the comet's past passage, wondering whether the heavens themselves had imbued his pen with a sliver of divine intent. And in that pregnant silence, he recognized the gravity of what lay before him. These quatrains were not mere curiosities to be filed away in dusty archives, but living oracles poised to reshape the arc of history. Each folded page in the notebook felt like a sealed covenant between himself and destiny, demanding that he prepare for the moment when his writings would slip beyond the confines of solitude into the hands of those who wielded true power. His thoughts turned to the whispers of courtly intrigue he had heard in Provence's taverns, tales of a queen who, beset by political storms as fierce as any plague, might welcome the counsel of one whose visions pierced the veil of the future. It was here, in this private chamber still redolent with candle soot and the petrichor of last night's rain, that a new ambition flickered. To transcend the wandering life of a roving healer and astrologer and step onto a grander stage where his talents could turn the tide of empires. And yet, even as he envisioned the hushed audience of courtiers leaning forward at the revelation of each quatrain, a deeper question gnawed at him. Could the very words he had labored to refine, words born of solitude and fever, survive the crucible of interpretation, or would they be twisted by ambition into tools of conquest and despair? This analytical trepidation only heightened the drama of his next steps, for prophecy divorced from conscience could prove as destructive as any plague. With resolve, hardened by the memory of personal loss and the haunting clarity of his midnight revelation, Michel finally eased back onto the pillow, quill tucked like a dagger in his grasp, and prepared himself for what must come next. Outside the shuttered window, the first pale light of dawn stretched across the Provençal hills, as though unveiling a world hungry for the portentous words he would soon unleash. And so, as he exhaled a breath that tasted of both fear and exhilaration, he dared to whisper into the gathering day, "Next time, how these quatrains will journey from this humble notebook to the gilded halls of Catherine de Medici, and why the Queen of France will come to regard me as her most trusted seer." In that moment, the line between the private agony of a gifted soul and the public spectacle of courtly favor blurred forever, setting the stage for the legend of Nostradamus to unfold.